Hi, and welcome back to the panel room. So tonight I'm going to be your host, Jim Nettles, and I'm going to be your sitting on the bench as we're talking about lawyers and the law. Before we get started tonight, though, do want to make sure that nobody regards anything that we may say in here as legal advice. If you do need an attorney, I feel sure you can write a check for one of these guys. But before we go too far down that pike, let's make sure everybody knows who has come to join us. So, Jack, you're up first.
My name is Jack Cullen. I'm the author of Recollections of Midnight. My day job, I'm an attorney, but I'm also a police captain, so I'm driving both sides of this discussion.
Nancy?
I'm Nancy Northcott. I used to be an attorney. I practiced law for 18 years, mostly civil law, and now I'm not.
Wayland?
I write under the name Wayland Smith, unless you really hate this panel, and then my name is Jim Butcher. I've been a deputy sheriff for closing in on 21 years, including about 4 years at the courthouse. So I've got a decent chunk of experience on both sides of that.
Michael?
I'm Michael Ventrella. I'm a criminal defense attorney. I've been doing that since 1985, and that's pretty much all I do. I'm in court almost every day.
Landis?
Yeah, I'm Landis Wade. I call myself a recovering trial lawyer. I was a civil trial lawyer for 35 years. I retired a few years ago, and now instead of experiencing conflict on a daily basis, I write about it.
And Andy?
So I run under Andy Gallo. I've been a prosecutor for 25 years, and I was a public defender for 6 before that. So I kind of probably have tried more cases than most lawyers. Maybe not most lawyers in this panel, but most lawyers in general.
So tonight we want to take a look at how we see the law represented in fiction. How do we write about it? How do we craft it in storytelling? What are the things we see done? What are the things we don't see done so well? So, Jack, from your perspective, let's talk a little bit about what you see as kind of the common mistakes that would apply from your side of the world. I mean, we all know that fiction takes a lot of latitude. I mean, I see things written up in books all the time that I just bang my head against and move on because I know better. But what are some of the things that you see that don't necessarily or are not done necessarily well or don't represent what you would see from your side of the world?
Well, a lot of times the authors are making the same mistakes you see on TV, where a lot of stuff is either based on California law or just TV law. Like, you didn't read me my rights. Well, there's a certain point where an officer can read your rights. It doesn't have to be as soon as they arrest you. It's before questioning. So a lot of that stuff gets mangled. And yeah, I don't think the average person would know, but someone without background would definitely it's an itch you can't scratch.
Nancy, how about you?
Well, picking up on what Jack said, a lot of people do assume things are done the way they're done on TV. And TV shows are filmed, well, they used to be mostly filmed in California, and they're based on California law. But one of the biggest surprises for me when I graduated from law school and actually went to trial court class before graduation was in North Carolina, you don't roam the courtroom. You put your seat in the chair and you leave it there. And if you want to approach the witness or need a sidebar with counsel to talk to the judge, you get permission for that. You don't go circulating through the courtroom at will, which does cut down on a little of the dramatic potential when you're questioning.
How about you, Wayland?
Well, one of the things I've seen since, like I said, I've got the slightly different perspective on it. I know people really love to set it up this way in their books, but in my experience, the prosecutors and the defense attorneys actually tend to both know each other and like each other. There's not this in-depth blood feud going on.
Michael?
Well, I agree with everything people have said here, but we have to keep in mind that this is fiction, and fiction requires drama and conflict. If they made it realistic, half of this book would be someone sitting in front of a computer doing research, which is damn boring, so you want it to be a little bit exciting. But yeah, I'll agree that, TV can still make it seem unrealistic. Things happen way too fast. Lawyers seem to only have one case at a time. It's those kind of things just don't make much sense. I think if you were writing a story about a lawyer, you'd want to at least make some reference to other cases in the background and how long it takes for a case to get to trial.
And piggybacking on that, the other thing on a similar vein that I always see is whoever your fictional detective is, especially if they're in actual law enforcement, is only ever working one case at a time. And believe me, that never happens. It'd be nice.
Landis?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll pick up on the point about it's fiction. I asked John Grisham once at a book signing. I said, "Why do you make all the lawyers and judges out to be crooks?" And he says, "Because I want to sell some damn books." So I mean, that's part of the process. At the same time, though, I think it's important not to use TV as your research tool, because y'all remember the show L.A. Law that came out in the early '80s. There was this scene in there where I don't know, they spent 5 minutes on the so-called Speesman interrogatories. And if they're not on my desk by 9 o'clock in the morning, you're going to pay hell. Interrogatories are nothing more than a question that you send out in discovery to the other side. The other side takes about 60 days to respond to. So don't watch that and then write a scene involving the Speesman interrogatories, because a real lawyer is going to look at it and say, you don't know what you're talking about.
Now, if I can pick up on what Landis just said, I stopped watching. I loved Matlock. I loved Andy Griffith. I watched everything he ever did. But I was watching a courtroom scene in Matlock, and he was cross-examining a witness. And he got, it's California, so he was up by the witness chair, and he said, "That's okay, just whisper it to me." No one objected. And I just went, seriously? And I just had to turn the show off, because even though I was long out of the courtroom at that point, I was just like, opposing counsel should be on their feet over that. It's just, so yeah, that's another peril of TV law. Don't do that.
Andy, how about you?
So I guess I'll pick up on what Nancy was saying. Everybody has like this Matlock moment where they think they're going to solve the case and they're going to break people down on cross-examination. And it's rare. I mean, I think in my experience, I've caught maybe 3-4 people in blatant lies that changed the case. Like one time I was setting him up, and it's like, it was after school and and he's like, yeah. And I was like, but this happened on a Saturday. The judge had no poker face. He picked up the counter like that. And of course the jury saw everything, but it was true. So, I mean, those are few and far between, but like every legal story you see you have that aha moment where yeah, you're right. I lied. That's not true. Oh, and to pick up on something Wayland said, it depends. Not all prosecutors and defense attorneys are friends. Public defenders and prosecutors typically have a very acrimonious relationship, whereas private defense lawyers who actually, have clients and have to get them, they understand that the prosecutor is your best friend. If we can really help your case, or we can give you a really crappy plea offer.
And I'll just add to that, because most of my practice was civil. I did some domestic violence, pro bono stuff in criminal court. But the civil side is interesting, because as law firms have gotten bigger and bigger, and lawyers have gotten to know fewer and fewer of the people that practice in their same community, collegiality is being lost. And what happens then is, if the lawyers don't know each other, they do come more in conflict with each other, name call. So a lot of you could take some lessons of what you see in the real practice of law and make a real spicy scene in the courtroom if you knew, what those lawyers were actually doing. But for the most part, lawyers tend to get along with each other. But things happen in the courtroom. And I think it's, what you got. I just think that the courtroom scenes that are interesting to me that I read are not the ones that deal with everything that happens before and after and in between, but those little moments, those things that happen that are interesting, surprising, and also that reveal some things about the lawyers who were in those scenes and what's in their head about what's going on. So, and I think it's hard sometimes to know perhaps how lawyers would handle certain situations if you hadn't been a lawyer, or you don't really interview a lawyer or talk to a lawyer, figure out, what would you do in that situation, if you were faced with that, and check if you're writing in first person or third close. So I don't know. I guess it goes with whatever you're writing. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but I wouldn't try to write how to operate on somebody without talking to a doctor about how it's done. And I might want to know what's in your head when somebody says, oops, in the operating room, so you got to talk to a doctor to find that out.
Well, let's kind of flip this on its head a little bit, whether it's something from your own books, your own work, or whether it's stuff you've seen and read, what are the things that you think, and how do you like to see the law, legal systems, things like that applied in storytelling? And if it applies to some of your own stuff, how do you like to work with it and apply that? So, Nancy?
I've actually only written one book with a courtroom scene in it, and it's a mage courtroom. So their rules of evidence and procedure are a little bit different from ours. But I like to read stories where what's shown in the courtroom illustrates character or moves forward the plot. We don't need to know, as readers, every question counsel asks the witness. Now, I do appreciate it when the author understands the difference between a direct examination question, which usually cannot be a yes-no question, and a leading question, which is a cross-examination question and usually is a yes-no question. So I think if I were going to write a trial scene, I would go sit in a courtroom of the kind of thing I was going to write. If it's a civil case, I'd sit in a civil trial. If it was criminal court, I'd sit in district court. And both of those have rhythms, and the rhythms are different. And so I like it when a book captures the rhythm of the procedure and at the same time doesn't get bogged down in the details.
Wayland, how about you? How do you see your experience? What are the things that you like to see? How would you work it into a story?
I mean, just first of all, everything we said before, it's good to know the truth so you can choose to ignore it if you want to, so you can defend that choice later, or not you just come across looking like you don't know what you're doing. Everyone involved in the process is people, and you will get good people and bad people in every profession on every side. So if you want to have people doing something shady, you can certainly do that. Just, bear in mind there's good and bad on both sides, and no one involved is just one universally horrible thing. And one thing we haven't really touched on yet, but has been my experience in a lot of the trials that I've done security or courtroom work for, is you can also do a lot of interesting things with whatever the judge involved happens to be. And I've worked with judges that have ranged from the very studious, listening to every word, to some that probably should have had their own TV shows. So you can do a lot with whatever you choose to make into your judge for your courtroom scenes if you have those.
Michael, how about you?
Well, I honestly don't read much law or watch the TV shows because I get enough of it in my daily life. I kind of want to escape when I'm at home and have some time to myself. But when I do see those things, what bugs me mostly are the surprises, because really trials are not that much about surprises. It's very rare. I mean, every once in a while I have a client or a witness say something we didn't expect, but discovery surprises, I guess what I'm talking about. The Commonwealth, because I'm in Pennsylvania, sorry, the state and the defense attorney know what the evidence is going to be. We know what we're going to be presenting. We're not allowed to suddenly show up with something that doesn't exist, or the surprise witnesses that doesn't exist, with a few exceptions. And it's constant. I see it in TV shows all the time. Perry Mason was constantly doing that kind of stuff, and it just doesn't happen. And it bothers me when I see that. And there's too many movies I don't like. There's a couple that are just really good law. I guess we'll talk about those later, that I think follow the law pretty well. But too many of them, for those of us who are lawyers, we watch them and go, oh, they can't do that.
Landis?
Yeah. So when I read legal thrillers, I did kind of escape with John Grisham because I was, doing the civil practice during the day. I like, and there's an author in the Charlotte area, Webb Hubble. He was assistant attorney general at one time, had him on the podcast. He fell from grace, went to prison, involved in the Rose scandal and everything. And he told me on the podcast, he's the only man he knows that flew on Air Force One and Con Air in the same year. So that gives you some indication of his knowledge base there. And, he's written some really interesting legal thrillers that involve the criminal justice side that I'm not familiar with. I don't know what goes on when a prosecutor and a judge, each other, hot box, the defense counsel or whatever. And those things can happen maybe if you notch it up a couple. But what I like to see, so in the books that I've written, I start with sort of the pattern jury instructions because, the elements of the claim are there. So I've written a couple of books, that involve different kind of issues that I work into the story. And I think if you have some of the basics there, you can use that as kind of a springboard for your plot points as to what kind of evidence you want to talk about. And I like to think, that whole thing, show, not tell kind of thing. Well, I think if you show too much in a courtroom scene, it'll get boring. It's like you're the court reporter, right? And so I think that I've seen other legal thriller writers do a good job of telling in those places where you can just tell quickly a couple of facts that need to get out, but then save those dialogue scenes for the ones, the questions and answers that matter, And I think Grisham does a good job of that, because in his courtroom scenes, he doesn't stay long with the, Q&A. He kind of gives you the things, moves in, moves out, moves on. So I like the realism. I like to get at the heart of it. And I like to see that people know what they're talking about when it comes to, the law.
Andy?
So just like what Linda said, I mean, it really, I don't know everybody else. I typically write out most of my questions and then promptly ignore them when I get to doing my direct examination. But when you write them out, you see that like 80% of them are just like foundational questions, and they're boring. What's your name? Where do you live? What did you see? Did you see the red light? Before you get to the really meat of the facts, because you've got to establish all that through your witness. And so the one time I did try to write a courtroom scene, I kind of cut most of that out and just kind of zeroed in on like Linda said, a couple of key issues. But one thing I wanted to touch on, Michael said something about Perry Mason with the surprise witnesses. That was a real thing back then, because my very first job was working for a small law firm in Pennsylvania. And the name partner was like 83, and this is now 30 some years ago. And he was reliving the past and talking about the things he was doing. And there was no discovery back then in criminal cases. It was, there was, but it wasn't much. And so surprise witnesses were all a thing. And now it's like not a thing. And it was so interesting, because I remember thinking about him like, wow, that's such ancient history. And I've been a prosecutor for 25 years. And I remember when there was no body camera, there was no search warrants for Facebook, and no downloads of your cell phones, and no CCTV cameras all around. And I feel like a dinosaur now, because back then, here's your paperwork, here's your pictures, here's your evidence log, here's the 911 cassette tape. Let's go. And that's ancient history. So it depends on when you're writing. I guess if you're trying to write 50s, it's very different than 2000s and 2020s even.
Yeah, the rules, you need to know what the current rules are. The district attorney, for instance, is not allowed to put on a surprise witness. The defense attorney, though, can get away with it a lot more, because the defendant doesn't have to put anything on if they don't want to, in a criminal case, that is. So there have been times that I've had witnesses show up that were kind of a surprise to the DA, but they can't be alibi witnesses. Alibi witnesses, we have to let them know in advance so they can prepare for it. But just general, specific witnesses that saw the scene that I didn't tell the DA that they had seen the scene, and that can make a big difference.
So can I add something about surprise witnesses? Because I think y'all have all probably been in this situation. A fun thing to do in writing fiction is for the lawyers to be surprised by their own witnesses. And that does happen. I mean,
Yes.
it could be that, you don't go through discovery and everybody thinks the witness, they know what they're going to say, but then they don't say exactly that. And then you got to pivot and you got to figure out what's going on. And it's fun sometimes to do that, because there might be a plot line that comes out of that surprise testimony. So keep that in mind. Surprise the person whose point of view you're in when you're in the courtroom.
I have a story about that if we have time for it later.
Yeah.
No, that's always, well, depending on what side you're on. I've always found that very hilarious to watch, because I've seen multiple cases tagged by the witness. And you can tell the lawyer's trying to get them to stop talking and keep going, and it's like you're trying to keep a straight face. That's great for book stuff. My thing is when they're using a very basic law procedure that a first-year law student would know as a aha moment. Like, I dug this out of... I'd like to see the writers go deeper than that, because anybody with a basic knowledge of law knows it's something that's easily done. And you see that more in TV than books, but it just seems to be recurring. And
one tip there to add is, get in somebody who's a friend of yours or a beta reader who's a lawyer to read that scene for you and give you some feedback. I think that's very helpful. If I'm going to write a scene, like I said, I talk about the doctor again, but I'm going to show it to my doctor friend and say, what did I miss here? And I mean, I wrote a couple of books, my recent book that involved a will contest, and I had never tried a will contest. So I went to my partner at the time, who was an estates lawyer, and we talked at length about what's involved in an estates case. Now, 95% of that never got in the book, right? But it gave me a grounding, for what that kind of case was, so that I didn't do something stupid when I was writing that scene. So talk to someone who or get them to read that scene. I think that's a good tip.
Can I pick up on what Landis just said? I have a friend who used to live in this area, and she reads a lot. And she was an assistant district attorney at the time. And she answered questions for me. And she said to me one day, if you have any friends who have a question, I'd be glad to help them out. I mean, we used to joke that she needed a T-shirt that said consultant to the muse. She went from being a district attorney to being counsel for one of the state bars out west. But a fair number of lawyers, if you say to your friend, who wrote your will? Do you think they would talk to me if I took them out to lunch and just explain some things to me? Because you're not asking for legal advice. And for goodness sake, don't ask for legal advice under the guise of writing a book, because that's bad. And actually, people can spot that. So it's worth trying it, because somebody somebody who's had a will, somebody who's had an accident handled, somebody who's had a speeding ticket, somebody, Lord help them, who embezzled something, knows a lawyer. And there are lawyers out there who will talk to you without doing a consultation if all you want is information for a book. It's worth a try.
Can I?
Kind of thing for, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to add that one of the things that's
Go ahead, Michael.
one of the things that's interesting right now that I think we should all start thinking about when we incorporate is technology in writing. Because the last homicide case I had, I got called to the bench after I had a witness who, after prepping him 3 or 4 times on his video, didn't even remember what he was supposed to say. And I asked him, do you see anybody in your body camera you recognize? And he said, no. So we just cut him off because we didn't need him. And I walked him out to sign him out, and I yelled at him. I said, he goes, what's my sergeant's name? And I yelled at him like, I was talking about the guy with a bullet hole in his chest. And everybody in the courtroom heard. And it got picked up on the audio, and the judge told me, yeah, you got to keep your temper down because it just got picked up on the. So technology is something we can use to great, don't embarrass yourself like I did, but you can use it for great, to try and break up here the monotony of a court scene.
Something to create a little conflict. Technology will always fail at the worst possible time.
All I was going to say was that the advice that Nancy gave is true of any profession where you don't know something. If you're writing, basically write what you know. And if you don't know, find someone who does know. And I've found over the years that when I needed advice, people are more than happy to talk to you. They love to brag about what they know. And you give them a little thank you at the end. I had a story where I needed what the FBI would do. And I found an FBI person just by going online saying, does anyone know an FBI agent? And got great advice. And they just love to talk to you, So lawyers aren't any different. Lawyers love to talk after all. So yeah, whenever you're writing about something you don't know about, find an expert, because it's just going to make if nothing else, it might give you some new ideas that you hadn't thought of before too.
In the same vein, I was going to say that that also definitely works for law enforcement. Almost every law enforcement agency that I know of has some version of a public information officer. They have someone who's paid to answer questions, as well as most of the officers, deputies, detectives, whatever, are also certainly willing to answer questions when they can. And what I always say when I'm doing panels about research, you can ask questions that should get you punched in the nose if you start with the magic words. And the magic words are, I'm a writer and I was wondering. And people will tell you everything about everything.
I would add, you might want to say, I'm a writer, not a reporter.
Yeah. So let's actually change this just a little bit. Let's go to the side of people, because again, at the heart of every story is about the people. It's about the characters, giving life to them. So if you're writing law enforcement, if you're writing attorneys, if you're writing even the other side of the bench, if you're writing the judges, if you're writing the defendants, if you're, whatever the case may be, what are kind of the different elements that you would work into creating the character you're working on that might be different from other kinds of stories? So, Wayland?
Get as much inside information as you can so you can put in a few details that both people in the profession will know and recognize, and people who aren't in the profession might find really interesting and something they didn't really know about. Like, what's a judge's routine? What happens in the courtroom before the people show up? The way the courthouse as a whole functions. Just find a couple really interesting, or at least different little things that not everyone has done a million times, and find a way to work those in.
Michael?
I think that's the key of writing good characters, is not making them all stereotypes and exactly what you might expect, and try to find out what's different about them and what's interesting. The judges in my courtroom don't all get along with each other necessarily in my courthouse. And, that's something you can work into it and make it a little bit more interesting. And, just look what's going on in the Supreme Court right now. They're practically yelling at each other. Don't think that they're all stately, geniuses who sit behind their black robes. Sometimes you can become a judge just because you got elected. It doesn't mean you're smarter than the lawyers. It doesn't mean you're better than the lawyers. You just got elected. So, keep those kind of things in mind when you're writing. They're still people. They're not just figureheads on the bench.
I just remember.
Jim, I'm glad you brought.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, Jim, I'm glad you brought this topic up because believe it or not, lawyers are human. And,
Wait, what?
You've heard that, right? We're human beings. And the idea there is that there are all kinds of us, right? And everybody has different challenges, different wants, different needs. And I think, but exploring that in the context of the world, I think it's interesting to try to find out, what that world is like. If you're going to be writing about a lawyer, you need to find out what their world is. Are they a prosecutor? Are they a defense attorney? Are they a plaintiff's lawyer? Where do they live? Where are they on the spectrum? And where are they on the ethical spectrum, right? Because that's also important a lot of times. Are they struggling with the fact that they got this secret that they probably ought to report their client on, or maybe they shouldn't, and they're dealing with an ethical, or maybe they're just, they're crooks or something, as John Grisham would write them. But I do think it's interesting to try to get into their world. And I just have a couple. So I wrote my latest novel is called Deadly Declarations. It's about a 65-year-old lawyer. I'm 65, but don't get any conclusions here. But he gets kicked out of his big law firm, and he ends up in a retirement community. When he gets kicked out, I just had a couple of sentences to kind of describe what I thought was happening to the law profession, to give you a little hint here. His name is Craig Travail, and I'll just read two sentences here. But it says he just lost his third case in a row, right? So he's really struggling. It says, Travail measured his breath, something he learned to do to manage the stress and anxiety. Sometimes the tactic worked, but today the in and out breathing exercise was an irritant, reminder he was still alive and someone he loved wasn't. He stepped from his office and walked with a regular stride down the East Corridor, where the law firm's commercial litigators breathed but barely lived. No one appeared in the hallway to give him encouragement. Solid wood doors with brass handles were shut, with lawyers huddled behind them, typing, dictating, or talking on their phones. Unsociable is what the billable hour that made the uptown lawyer, not like the old days. So that's just sort of a peek into this guy's he's come 35 years in a profession where it used to be, the lawyers talked to one another. They went out to lunch together, that kind of thing. Now it's totally flipped, and he's on his way out, and on his way out, he's realizing that there's nobody there that's like him anymore. I don't know. I just think it's interesting to me that when you can get into the world of someone who's been there, you can find out a little bit about the nuances. Somebody might ask, what the hell's a billable hour? What do you mean, that unsociable is what the billable hour made lawyers? Well, it has. I know maybe not in the criminal justice system as much, but certainly in the civil justice system, people don't eat together. You don't learn, when you go out to lunch together like you used to with a senior partner. And these are little things. Small things that kind of give you a peek into that environment. The kind of things I'd like to know if somebody's writing, about politicians or doctors, how does that world work and how has it changed from what it used to be?
Landis, do you think that also holds true at smaller law firms, or is that mainly at the big firms? Because I haven't worked in a law firm in quite some time, and I don't know what the culture is.
people always leave thinking, well, if I go in house or I go to a small law firm, it'll be less stressful, grass will be greener. But everybody knows here the law practice is going to be stressful, no matter whether you're doing it in a big firm or a small firm. But I do think that there are pressures today because of the technology and the fact that people turn things around with emails, whereas it used to be you can send a letter and wait a couple of days before you had to respond again. But with all the technology, it just ramps up. So I think maybe not so much the billable hour in the smaller firms, but the stress is still certainly there. You're not going to get less stress by going to a smaller firm. That's just my personal opinion.
Well, I was just wondering about the collegiality aspect.
Collegiality, the big firms is sort of compartmentalized. You might have small groups that work together and they know each other, but maybe you don't know everybody on the big level. And where small firms, people know each other more. But we're getting off on a tangent here. Sorry about that. But I guess the point is, I'll close here, is that I do believe that it's important to write about lawyers as people and to try to find out what that character's like, because the plot is not going to carry the legal thriller as much as the character is, right? I mean, we can screw up that courtroom scene, but if we like the character who's screwing it up, it's going to be kind of fun.
I'm going to say that technology, I think, has made things better for some of us. In my experience, I've become friends with many of the DAs and fellow defense attorneys and public defenders on Facebook. I email them every now and then. When we have a conference about a case, we can email back and forth, and it's much more friendly in some ways because of that. At the same time, I can be kind of snotty in my comment. They know not to take it too seriously because they know who I am, and sometimes I'm sarcastic. So in some ways, the technology has made it easy. Certainly has made it easier to file things. I just have to scan it in and file it nowadays. I don't have to walk to the courthouse or do anything like that anymore. So technology has certainly changed things since I've been practicing, in the 30-something years I've been doing this. And it has, I don't know if it's necessarily better, but it certainly is different, as you pointed out. And
on the flip side of that, there is actually now a jury instruction that I've heard, I don't know how many times, about disregarding the CSI effect.
Yes.
Because no, not every case has forensic evidence. Not every case has DNA. Not every case has the high-tech wonderland going on in the background. And that doesn't mean it's not a good case. It just means it wasn't relevant to the case at hand. But your average person getting called in for jury duty, it really seems like fewer and fewer of them are able to wrap their minds around that.
Sadly, I get to use that and the DAs don't, because quite often I'll go to the jury and say, well, where's the fingerprints? Where's the DNA? And the DA will come out and say, well, it's not in every single case, but I know the jury's bias is because of the CSI, and admittedly, I take advantage of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, with that, good DA, especially if they're questioning the clock, they can turn around and say, why did you do this? And then the police officer can explain it.
Yes.
But obviously they get at the time to do that. When you're talking about technology, from a police standpoint, it's also come a long way. You got evidence or whatever. I'll do something simple, graffiti, right? You get graffiti on a door that's a gang tag. Now, officer can just pull out a cell phone, take a picture of it, email it, done. You're not calling criminal out to take pictures or things along those lines. It's a lot easier. Ring cameras, CCTV. In a lot of ways, it's made our job a lot easier.
It's actually helped defense attorneys too. I do lots of DUI cases, and now that everyone's, they're all wearing cameras and everything's recorded. When my client says, I wasn't drunk, I can show them the video and say, yes, you were. Look at this video, for God's sake. Let me work out a deal for you. At the same time, I've also had cops claim someone was drunk, and I look at the video and go, no, they're not. And I show that to the jury, and I've won. So finding the truth is always good. Let's put it that way.
Sure. And technology helps.
Yes.
And that's just it. Finding the truth, finding justice. There was a personal injury case. They're trying to settle it. The insurance company is basically like, well, there's not a lot of damage to the vehicle. The woman who got hit from behind had a camera in the back of the minivan, and you can see the car bounce off of it. And all of a sudden, the settlement number changed drastically. And that came down to technology.
I just read a book.
There's actually a thing now that with these companies that come, you'd be surprised how much technology is in a car, how much video is in a car, how much data is in a car. It's more than your cell phone. So Jack's talking about how the camera's in the back, but these everything's computerized. I mean, that was the whole thing about like the supply chain issues, right? Because there's not enough chips. Well, it's because the cars have so many. And so can I just weigh in just briefly on the whole like writing characters, which I think that the biggest issue is that the courtroom is never as exciting as people think. And you know, and the other thing that's really interesting is judges are the top, you know, the apex predator, so to speak, but their job is boring because they just, I mean, if you're in a jury trial, your job is basically just a referee. You're like the referee in a boxing match, and that's it. So you don't have, it's hard to write a story from the judge's perspective in a courtroom because they don't do a lot. Whereas like the defense, like, you know, Michael's a defense attorney. So like, you know, he's always got to anticipate what the prosecutor is going to do. And, you know, Landis was a civil lawyer and Jack's a cop. I mean, everybody has their own little things that they're going to actually have to go in and present and talk and speak. And generally judges don't even get to ask questions if it's a jury trial. So you know, I think somebody else said it better than I will, but you got to make your characters engaging as if they didn't actually exist in the courtroom. And that courtroom scene should be really a small part of the whole story.
Yeah. No, Andy,
Go ahead.
Sorry, Andy hit that on the head. I knew I wanted to be a cop when I was 3. I knew I wanted to be a lawyer when I was 14, 16. I'm like, and I'll be a judge too. Well, I clerked for a judge, and I left there going, I'm never going to be a judge. It's boring. But you know, with the character development, you also got to stay away from tropes. You know, you got the shock lawyer, the messy white tie with mustard on it lawyer. You have the cop who's got 3 ex-wives and, you know, doesn't play by the rules. Those are the worst cops for us to have. We don't want those guys. We want officers that are grounded, family, friends, community stakeholders. And you can make those interesting. My series, Recollection of a Lunatic, the main character is a cop. It's in a magic community, which is funny because when I started writing, I'm like, no, I'm going to do this right. I'm going to use the actual. Yeah, those went out the window. You can't do it when you set something up like that. But one of the things I did is I had him grounded. He had a wife. He had 2 kids. He's got, you know, parents. And they play into the storyline. And that creates a more dimensional character. I had one reviewer read, oh, I know what's going to happen to the wife. No, you don't. But that was based on all these stories where the cop loses a spouse and is out for revenge. That's a trope. You want to make the characters a lot more three-dimensional, and you also want them in a way where your reader can relate to them.
But you know, judges can be a source of conflict. When I was a young lawyer, I was about to go in on a felony criminal defense, my 1 year of criminal defense work. And one of the older lawyers pulled me aside and said, okay, the judge is always in a bad mood. His mother lives with him. She drives him crazy. He snaps at everybody. Just be aware of that before you walk in there. And he was in his 60s. So his mother must have been, you know, of advanced years. And, you know, you have, as I'm sure everybody on this panel knows, you have judges who really are watching out to see that everything goes smoothly and that everything is done properly. Every once in a while, a judge will hop in, even though that's not their job, and they very, very rarely do. There was a judge in the county I worked in where if he heard a criminal case and it was obviously a cockamamie story from the prosecuting witness, you could see the red creep up his face. It would start here and then it would go all the way up. Or you would have a judge who just doesn't like what you're doing, doesn't like the client, doesn't like the prosecution witness, and snappish and short. And your only answer to that is, yes, Your Honor. I'm sorry, Your Honor. And then you roll with it and do whatever you have to get past it. But especially if you give that character a backstory and just don't make them two-dimensional cardboard, that can add some conflict to your story, and it can add some surprise, because I don't think even with judges who are like the first judge I mentioned, who are frequently in a bad mood, anybody expects to be just snapped at in open court all of a sudden. And it's kind of a shock when that happens to people. So
picking up on that, when I was still practicing law, my first 3 books, they were about lawyers trying to save Christmas, representing people that think they worked for Santa Claus. And one of the reviewers called it a cross between My Cousin Vinny and Miracle on 34th Street. By the way, let me just mention My Cousin Vinny that should be the transcript you look at to come up with some fun, interesting.
That was the example I was going to give earlier when I said there are a few movies that really follow and do everything right, and that's one of the ones that does.
It does. And so, but I took this idea that, there's a judge and he's about to retire. His name is Judge Augustus Langhorne Stark. And he's got people in his courtroom right at Christmas who think they work for Santa Claus. And he's not going to be happy about that, right? And he's going to run a tight courtroom. And so my story arc was about the judge changing, and sort of coming to terms with, this thing about whether it could really be real or not. So I think you can use what you mentioned, Nancy, a curmudgeon kind of judge, but then get into their head and their psyche as well, just as you could with any of the other participants in the courtroom scenes. I've seen some books where they write from the perspective of the court reporter. I mean, they see everything. They know what's going on in the courtroom and in the back hallway and everywhere else, and the bailiffs too. I mean, that's an interesting perspective to see what goes on in the courtroom. So, it'd be fun that you can move around perhaps with different characters in the courtroom to get a point of view. Maybe they'll give you a different insight than what you would see if you're just writing it from the head of the lawyer.
So as we're kind of starting to work towards wrapping up, one of the things, because we've covered a fair amount of ground, but there's a lot of ground we haven't gotten to, but I want to make sure everybody gets that opportunity. There's always going to be something that we haven't had a chance to cover, but that you think is really important. So as we're looking at and talking about this idea of creating and crafting stories that feature the law, feature attorneys, feature law enforcement, feature, cops, feature investigators, whatnot, judges, criminals, all this sort of thing. What's the one thing you think that somebody that is crafting a story around lawyers, the law enforcement, what's the one thing you think we haven't touched on tonight? So, Michael, I'm going to hit you up with that one first.
Oh, you would hit me first, wouldn't you?
Of course.
Yes. I think that there's too many people, and this is just a small point, but I was thinking about it, is that too many people think that too many criminals get off on loopholes. And they will write a story where the criminal gets off on some sort of loophole. They don't realize that's not necessarily how it works. For example, if you're found not guilty by reason of insanity, you don't get to go free. You got to go to, someplace else. They're going to go in the mental hospital or something, or if the loophole was that, they didn't read your Miranda rights. It doesn't mean you go free. It means they can't use your statement, but they can still convict you on other reasons. And too often, I certainly have to explain this to my clients quite often that, no, you're not going to win just because the cop got the color of your car wrong on the paperwork. These are the kind of things that sometimes I've seen in movies and, where someone gets off on some strange little loophole that doesn't really exist.
Landis?
Yeah. I mean, I think, Scott Turow wrote the seminal book that came out and, which was a full blown courtroom from beginning to end. And I don't think that's necessarily where that sort of genre is right now. I think if you're going to have in my view, if you're going to have a courtroom drama or legal drama, there's got to be more to it than just what's going on in the courtroom. There's got to be some stuff related, some other plot, subplots and that kind of thing, some interesting character development. And then you can use the courtroom to kind of spice up what's going on in these people's lives. So I think maybe it sort of gets back to the fact that lawyers are people. We are human, there are things going on in our lives. Don't necessarily just pick out, well, I'm going to write, it's not about whether the guy gets off or doesn't get off. I mean, if that was the end of the story, it would often be too predictable, right? I mean, if it's going to turn out good for the protagonist, they're going to win the case. And that's not always what's important. There are other things going on. I think somebody mentioned, cops with backgrounds or other things that are going on. Those are the kind of interesting stories that come into play that might offer some twists no matter how the case comes out. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but I throw that out from a character standpoint.
Andy?
So what I would say is that I think everybody looks at the courtroom as like the big drama, and that's where it all is. And really, most of the work is done before you ever get there. I mean, I'm sure Jack and Wayland have both dealt with, prosecutors who are jerks, and we dealt with officers who are frustrating us. But I mean, a lot of the drama happens off camera, so to speak. And the courtroom should be the final polished product, even though there is that, give and take, and, each side has their own strategy. And so it's going to throw you off somewhat. but most of the really interesting bits that you can write about are going to happen outside of the courtroom. And then you can just kind of see the little bits of it that happen in. So if you're writing about it, I think the most important part is to deal with the interactions between the lawyers or the police officers and as they prepare, because that's where some of the best lines come from, is all I can say.
Jack?
Yeah, I think we're all in agreement with that. We gotta have it outside the courtroom. I also like to see when you have, it goes into the storylines of multiple characters. What's the lawyer thinking? What's his background? What's the person he's representing? What background did they come from? What caused them to be in that position? Why did the cop do what he did? Why is the prosecutor pushing so hard for this? More than just have it from one point of view. If you want a good courtroom drama, all of those characters should be involved in very in-depth.
Nancy?
Personal code of conduct. For a while there, it was really popular to do novels, including romance novels, but not always romance novels, in which opposing counsel were having an affair or the lawyer was having an affair with the client. And I haven't looked at the North Carolina Code of Ethics since I hung up my license. So I'm assuming there's still not something specific in there about that. But I think it's standard in all the state codes of ethics. A lawyer shall avoid the appearance of impropriety. And if you are sleeping with opposing counsel, if you are sleeping with your client, your judgment is arguably compromised. And that is an appearance of impropriety. And in my opinion, it is impropriety. So if somebody is going to do a story about that, there needs to be some repercussions from that. I mean, it's like Michael was mentioning LA Law earlier. Oh my word, the bed hopping on LA Law. I got nothing against bed hopping in a story, but when it's involving lawyers and clients, it's not just a throwaway. It's important. And I think that gets overlooked too often.
Wayland?
If you're going for anything approaching a real world setting, do a little bit of research about what you're getting into. You always see on TV it's the district attorney, but in some places it's not. In some places it's a Commonwealth attorney. The laws in the state of Louisiana are based on the Napoleonic Code, which is different from any other state in the United States. So both look into that to see if you can get your stuff right, and just, you never know what interesting thing you might find that'll give you another idea for something else to toss into your story.
So, Michael, I know you had a little story you wanted to try to work in.
Oh, I was just going to tell a story about, you were talking about surprises, and I had a trial just like about a month ago where my defense for my client was that it wasn't him that committed the crime. It was this other guy who's currently in prison. And so the DA had the witness on the stand, and the DA showed him a picture and said, "Is this the person who did it?" Showing him the picture of the person that we claim did it. And the witness said, "Yeah, that's him. All right." And the DA just wasn't expecting that, obviously. So sometimes surprises really do happen in a trial, and I just sat there smiling as big as I could be. And you bet I brought that up in the closing. I was just going to say that's an interesting thing, that you could write that in a book and you might go, "Oh, that's just too much of a coincidence." But sometimes those things really do happen.
So I want to throw one more little quick idea out there for everybody. We were just talking about using My Cousin Vinny as being a good representative case of storytelling for the courtroom. Are there any other cases you guys have got as an idea that somebody could look at and use as a model, either for good or for bad? Whether it's your favorite or the worst one.
I'll toss two out for law enforcement, actually, since that's more of my experience. But the two shows that I think have done the best with showing what it's really like to be in law enforcement are Barney Miller, if you go back a ways. Yep. And then many years after that, NYPD Blue, I thought did a really good job on most of at least the aspects of, these are people trying to deal with their lives, and then all this weird stuff happens on the job.
I'd add Hill Street Blues in that. But
yeah, Hill Street too.
So there was a Grisham book that turned into a movie. I was picking a jury trial that lasted like 3 months, one of the longer civil trials in North Carolina, and the judge gave us so much latitude we can even ask them what they're reading. And I'm representing the defendant, and he says, "Well, you don't want to know what I'm reading." So I'm like stuck. Then I got to ask him, and the other jurors are going to ask him. So I'm going to ask him. He said, I'm reading The Runaway Jury by John Grisham. And, I bring this up, and this is another thing you can't predict. I mean, when we had closing arguments at the end of that 3 months, the jury wore all red shirts when I argued to the jury, and wore all black shirts when the other side argued to the jury. Totally messed with our heads, right? Everybody had jury consultants. We're looking up why would they do this, and after the fact, they told us they were just messing with us. We kept them in court for 3 months, so they wanted to have fun with us. So I'd say, take these little things and, take what's believable, what's true, and then ratchet that up 3 or 4 notches. Because like the movie Runaway Jury, yeah, there are some jury consultants that, bend the line a little bit, but not like, who was the guy that played? Was it, anyway, they bent the line a lot in that one. They were buying off jurors and doing all kinds of things there. So ratchet it up 3 or 4 times to sell your book, but make sure it has sort of a grain of truth to it to start with.
Any other thoughts?
I would give you 2. One is, I think the old Law and Order did a really good job of showing just the good bits of, they kind of gave you snippets, they didn't bog you down. And then the other one is to go back to something Michael said. I swear to God that my last trial, I'm going to go Lane Kirkland on everybody and go, identical. At one point on my last trial, I plan to do that just for the hell of it.
There's only one courtroom scene that I remember in the Netflix Daredevil show, but Matt Murdock is absolutely on fire. And I thought that was really good.
And I could say She-Hulk is not very impressive lawyer-wise, but it's a fun show, though, otherwise.
I haven't seen that yet. I'm waiting until I hit deadlines, and then I'm going to binge it.
Yeah, and I'm not a real fan of although it's kind of interesting to watch, the Lincoln Lawyer on Netflix now, or wherever they're showing it. That guy pulls things out of his rear end in every criminal trial. They really only last about 30 minutes, right? He gets the client, they go to trial, he pulls something. So yeah, that some of those things are a little far-fetched.
I'd be interested to know what the people on this panel who work with criminal law in its various aspects think of Blue Bloods. Because that's one of the few network shows we watch, and it's got courtroom scenes, but they're criminal scenes, and it's set in New York. So
Haven't seen it.
I don't watch it. It's too much like real life. I'm a 4th generation police officer. My wife was a police officer. So you get around the table, it's similar. So it's too much like real life. I don't watch it.
Yeah.
You're going down that Marissa Tomei. My father was a mechanic. My uncle was a mechanic. My 2 brothers are mechanics. My 16 uncles are mechanics. Yeah,
pretty much. Yeah.
Positive traction on that rear axle. Yeah.
It was funny for years. My father had a partner whose son became a lawyer, and he's like, I disown him. I became a lawyer. Crickets. Right? But he'd throw shots at me. I can't believe you became a lawyer. I can't believe it. Well, he got in an argument with someone he bought something from that kind of pulled a fast one, and first thing he did was whip that out of his back pocket. My son's a lawyer. I'm like, oh, okay, now it's okay.
Yes.
You finally became useful.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I appreciate everything this evening. I think it's been a great chat. But before we get out here, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. Website, social media, and what's that latest thing you want to push. So, Jack, you're up first.
I can be found at jackcullenwrites.com. I got the Recollections of Runate series. I got the first 3 books out. 4th book should be out next year. And I have a nonfiction book that should be out next year as well, called the Massachusetts Murder Book, which is 25 murders that took place in Massachusetts. Little known ones like the first recorded one in history, and some of the more famous ones like the Charles Stewart murder and Jeffrey Carroll case.
Nancy?
You can find information about me and about my books at nancynorthcott.com. My most recent release, which will be out by the time you see this, is Embattled Mage, which is actually the 4th in a series. This series is not about lawyers and the law. There's a brief scene in Renegade Mage that is, but it's brief and it's imaginary law, so it probably won't be very helpful to you if you're writing legal scenes. So that's kind of it. Oh, and you can find me on Twitter, where I spend more time than is probably good for me, and I'm at Nancy Northcott.
But the good news is the heroes in that series spend a lot of time in their briefs. So, Wayland.
I'm on Twitter as at Wayland Smith 1. I still want to find who beat me to that. I review all of the superhero-based TV shows and movies, like we were just talking about Daredevil and She-Hulk, for a site called comicbookclog.com. I didn't name it, I just work there. My last release is Old Gods and New Drugs, which is about a team of superhuman mercenaries called Wildside. And one of them in his civilian job is a lawyer who specializes in superhuman law.
Michael?
Hi, you can find me at michaelaventrella.com or michaelventrella.com. My latest novel is what you see behind me, which is a Teddy Roosevelt steampunk adventure called Big Stick. I've got about 5 novels, a short story collection. I've edited about 10 anthologies now, and I have a couple of nonfiction books, including one called How to Argue the Constitution with a Conservative, which is meant to be fun and learn about the Constitution while laughing.
Landis?
You can find me at landiswade.com. And my latest novel is Deadly Declarations, about 3 unlikely retirees, one being a lawyer who tries to solve the mystery of a deceased 96-year-old resident, his mysterious will, and the controversial first American Declaration of Independence that John Adams accused Thomas Jefferson of plagiarizing from. For those from Charlotte, we know that as the MEC deck there. So another thing I want to mention is that CharlotteReadersPodcast.com is where we've got over 300 episodes, and we're doing something now where we're offering authors the opportunity to practice their elevator pitches. And you can go to a link on our website at the contact button, click on that, and speak pipe your way onto the podcast by honing your 30-second elevator pitch. So y'all are all welcome to do that. And anyone who's watching, keep it at 30 seconds. You might hear yourself on the podcast.
Andy?
You can find me at andygallo.com. The next book coming out is November 22nd, and it's paranormal. It's Break the Spell. It's a magical one. It's no law in it. I'm sorry.
And I've been having the pleasure of wearing my position on the bench this evening and trying to keep these people under control. But I'm Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, authoressentialsworkshops.com, the Speculative Fiction Academy, and of course, your ConTinual. And we will see all of you guys soon.